When I was growing up in Dallas, camping was never something I did willingly. Why would anyone want to go out to the wilderness and deal with bugs? The whole idea seemed ridiculous. It wasn't until I left for college that I realized how fun it could actually be. During my 4 years at North Texas, I went from being a die-hard city kid to someone who could have survived in the wild. But then, something happened that ruined my love for the outdoors to this day. As I mentioned, I never really got along with nature before moving to Denton. If there was a spider web, I would always find it. If mosquitoes were around, I was their prime target. You get the idea. By chance, I ended up rooming with a guy from near Lufkin. He had grown up surrounded by woods, and some of his friends from home were also at North Texas with us. They often went camping around the state during breaks, so when spring break came up, they invited me to join them at Lake Texoma. If you haven't heard of it, Texoma is a well-known lake near Denison, famous for its fishing and scenic beauty. I wasn't thrilled about staying in Dallas, and I didn't really know any of the cool kids who were heading to the coast, so Texoma it was. With no camping experience, I relied entirely on my friends for advice. I borrowed gear, made do with what I had, and the only thing I didn't skimp on was bug spray. Deep Woods Off became my best friend. That trip turned out to be an eye-opener. Since I had covered myself in bug spray, I was finally able to focus on the experience itself. Everything was going smoothly, and then I caught my first fish. I was hooked. The rest of the trip was spent learning everything I could about the outdoors. After that, I made sure I joined every camping trip for the next 2 years. That summer, I even made it to the coast. When I wasn't in class or resting, I walked everywhere, from one end of town to the other. Despite being a university town, Denton still had that small town charm. I knew the woods and tracks by heart, and in the warmer months, I spent hours honing my skills at the nearby Lake Louisville. I don't think my friends from East Texas knew as much about the woods as I did. Over time, my friends back in Dallas told me I had changed. I didn't mind, though. I was determined never to leave nature behind, and in a way, I've always stayed connected to it. But as much as I love the outdoors, I don't think I'll ever be able to return to the woods the way I once did. It was spring break during my final year when I decided to go on one last camping trip. By this point, some of my camping buddies had either dropped out of school or transferred. Only a couple of guys remained, but we didn't really keep in touch. I had been planning a big trip to a popular national park in the eastern part of the state. I won't name it here, as I don't want to discourage anyone from visiting, but it's known for its natural beauty, despite some darker rumors surrounding it. Before leaving, I had been warned to watch out for overzealous hunters, but I knew this trip wouldn't coincide with hunting season, so I felt safe. After checking my list one last time, I loaded my Jeep and made the 3-hour drive to my campsite. I arrived just after 3 p.m., set up camp, and decided to explore a bit before dinner. It was then that I noticed something strange. Well, I didn't actually see anyone, but the feeling that I was being watched lingered. I cut my hike short and returned to camp. Though bears weren't known to live in this area, I had read some stories online, and the idea of being eaten on my first day wasn't exactly appealing. After a quick dinner, I hit the sack just after dark. Nothing unusual happened that night as far as I could tell. The next morning, the air was crisp and fresh, probably the cleanest I had ever breathed. Breakfast was quick and simple, though I don't recall exactly what it was. The beauty of the morning made me eager to explore, so I packed a small day bag with some emergency supplies and snacks and set off on the trail. The next few hours were peaceful, with only the occasional snap of twigs or rustling leaves breaking the silence. Around 11 a.m., I stopped for a snack. While I waited for my stove to heat some water, I leaned against a pine tree and must have dozed off. That was when a mosquito decided to make a meal of my neck. I woke with a start, swatted the pest, and then noticed a flash in the distance. I briefly questioned whether I had imagined it, but the loud call of a crow confirmed that I wasn't alone. Though I wasn't scared yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Eventually, the crow moved on, and I was able to finish my coffee in peace. I figured if whoever was out there hadn't shown themselves by now, they probably meant me no harm. I spent a little more time at that spot before packing up and continuing my hike. After about another half hour, it became clear that I wasn't alone. Whoever had been trailing me hadn't learned to be quiet in the woods. The rustling of leaves was faint but constant, and a strange smell started drifting toward me. I stopped and sniffed the air, and suddenly, everything went quiet. Achich randon mispin. My curiosity got the best of me, and despite my instincts, I walked toward the smell. I had only taken a few steps when a puff of dirt shot up near me. A split second later, I heard a loud crack. I turned, and before I could react, another crack came from behind. It dawned on me that I was being shot at, and I hit the ground instantly. I didn't dare move, holding my breath, trying to hear any movement. The warnings about overzealous hunters rang in my head. I yelled, hoping the shooter would realize their mistake, but there was no response. I stayed still, listening. Eventually, the sounds of the forest returned, confirming I was no longer being targeted. Still shaken but unhurt, I got to my feet, brushed myself off, and the strange smell hit me again. For some reason, I didn't learn my lesson and started walking toward it once more. This time, a quick series of shots rang out in my direction. I didn't think, just turned and ran as fast as I could. My only goal was to make it back to safety. I prayed over and over for a safe escape, but a couple of shots rang out behind me. I didn't stop to check where they hit, too focused on getting away. I ran for what felt like forever, only stopping when my body gave out. No shots had come for a while, but I wasn't about to stay in the same place. After chugging down some water, I continued my escape at a much slower pace. Within the hour, I was back at camp. I was desperate to leave and get back to Denton as quickly as possible. I packed up without wasting time, even leaving the fire half done. Something I would never have done under normal circumstances. I didn't want to contact the police, fearing I'd be forced to return to the scene of what had happened. The thought made me feel sick. The further I got away from the national park, the guilt started eating at me. I couldn't help but think that someone else might stumble onto what I had left behind. I didn't think I could live with the guilt of a preventable death. Around 20 miles out, I finally found a police station. I reported the incident, but the officer wasn't too surprised. He mentioned the overzealous hunter theory, but I didn't buy it. Had the shooting stopped when I shouted out, that might have made sense. The truth was, I had no idea what had happened, and neither did the officer. He promised to check it out, but I wasn't hopeful. I didn't think they'd find anything, let alone contact me.
He didn't got it.
There was no way I was ever going back to that place. When I got home, I probably looked like a fool kissing the ground outside my house, but the relief was overwhelming. Things went back to normal over time, but despite the terrifying event, I intended to go back to the woods, just not those woods. I was browsing through 4chan one day when a post caught my attention. The original poster had been hiking in an area he thought he knew well. Rumors had been circulating for years about huge marijuana farms being guarded by cartel members, but he never took them seriously. That is, until he accidentally stumbled upon one of these grow sites. No one had been around, so he tried to leave quietly. As soon as he turned to leave, gunfire erupted around him. He was grazed on the cheek but managed to escape. The experience terrified him, and he was too scared to report it. The whole thing seemed too convenient to me, but the idea stuck with me. I hadn't considered the possibility of something like that happening before, but after my experience, it felt more real. Years have passed, and life is much like it was before I went to college. The only difference is that I'm older and much more aware of the natural world. Sometimes, I find myself gazing into the woods near my home, feeling that same pull I once did, but it's not the same. I know that the odds of something like what I experienced happening again are slim, but it's not fear that keeps me away, not anymore. Now, when I look at the woods, I can't see them in the same way. What I encountered has changed how I view the wild, and it'll never be as beautiful to me as it once was. But I keep my memories, and I share what I know with anyone who's interested. I prefer to remember the woods as they were: pure, pristine, and beautiful. In the early summer of 2018, I set off on a long-awaited camping adventure out west. The trip had been in the works for nearly 2 years, and it would be my first time camping with firearms. The drive to the destination was enjoyable, and I discovered a lot about that region of the country I hadn't known before. Once I arrived, I parked my truck and let my contact know I had safely reached the area. We reviewed my plan one final time, and I began the long hike to my campsite. The first day was peaceful. The weather was perfect, so I slept outside by the fire. It was a refreshing feeling of freedom compared to the restrictions back home. The next day was much like the first. I walked slowly, taking in the wildlife around me. Around 1:30 p.m., I reached the spot I had planned to camp. A quick check confirmed it was a good choice, and soon I had everything set up and was cooking lunch. Afterward, feeling a bit sleepy, I decided to do some shooting since that was the reason I had come. About 200 yards from camp, I found a dry creek bed, which seemed like the safest place to shoot. I set up a few steel targets and began firing. The excitement I felt was hard to explain. This must have been what the pioneers experienced, I thought. I had gone through a box of ammo and was reloading my SKS when I heard gunshots echoing through the hills. Curious, I went to investigate. The shots kept coming, and they seemed to come from several different firearms, which made me uneasy. I decided to head back to camp, sensing that the shooters might not be too welcoming. In hindsight, it was a decision I still question but also thank myself for making. When I returned, I thought about what to have for dinner. The shooting stopped soon after I got back, so I assumed they had moved on and that the evening would be quiet. After cleaning my guns for about an hour, I sat back by the fire and dozed off. Instead of cooking a full meal, I snacked on crackers and bacon-flavored cheese. As the sun began to set, I decided to turn in early. It was completely dark when a noise woke me. I jumped up and looked outside my tent but saw nothing. Assuming it was just a dream, I lay back down. But then, I heard it again. A chilling scream, unlike anything I'd ever heard. It was the worst sound, more terrifying than the cries of a rabbit being killed by a predator. The screams continued, followed by a woman's voice calling for help. My heart raced. What should I do? I briefly considered grabbing my rifle and rushing into the darkness, but by now it was clear where the screams were coming from, the same direction the gunshots had been earlier. I chose to stay put, and just then, another scream rang out, followed by a single gunshot. I was frozen with fear, unsure of what to do until daylight. The feeling of freedom I had earlier was gone. I anxiously awaited the sunrise, convinced that danger was coming with the dawn. When the sun finally rose, I packed up my gear in record time and began heading back to what I considered a safer place, or really anywhere but there. A journey that had taken me a day and a half just days before took me less than one to return. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder, my rifle gripped tightly, expecting someone to be chasing me. I reached my truck just after dark and drove home, relieved to be leaving. But as the relief began to fade, guilt settled in. I thought I had heard a woman in desperate need of help being murdered, and yet I did nothing. I didn't report it, didn't try to help. For the entire drive home, my mind battled between my ego and reason. One moment, I hated myself, calling myself a coward. The next, I told myself it would have been foolish to chase after unknown attackers in the dark. The truth is, I was afraid like a child seeing their first scary movie. But at the same time, running off into the night after several unknown assailants would have been reckless. Yet the guilt still stings to this day. I didn't act heroically or cowardly, but in the end, I wondered if I should have reported what happened. What I had witnessed was a stretch. Really, I only heard a few screams and gunshots in the middle of nowhere without solid evidence. Reporting it would likely have just made me a nuisance to the authorities. Months later, I finally found the courage to learn what had really happened. I was camping just a mile away from a notorious outlaw biker gang. That day, they had arrived at their usual spot, where they would use illegal firearms. Unfortunately, they had also kidnapped a woman hiker, subjecting her to hours of abuse. After they released her, she managed to escape and flee from their camp. Those screams for help were her desperate cries, but she was shot and left to die. In a miracle, the woman survived. She somehow found her way to the highway and managed to get help. After a week in the hospital, she was released. The bikers, knowing they were caught, accepted plea deals, and most of them will spend the rest of their lives in prison. Though I was relieved to hear the victim survived, I couldn't stop thinking about the what-ifs. What if I had done something? What if I had reported it sooner? I never told anyone about this, and writing it here is probably the closest I'll ever come to sharing it. If you think I'm a coward for not intervening, I don't blame you. This story wasn't meant for people like you. It's for those who understand the temptation to avoid conflict. I get it now, the fear of being punished for doing the right thing. Many people who try to help others end up paying the price for it. But I can tell you from experience that the guilt of an action is far worse than the risk of stepping in. We're all in this together. If we can, we should help those in need. Imagine being in someone else's shoes. You could be the only one standing between them and survival. Growing up, stability was a luxury I didn't know. After splitting up with my dad, my mom dated a string of guys, even letting some move in. When I was around 15, she married a guy named Mike, whom she met at the bar where she worked. Mike was a real jerk and tried to take my dad's place in my life. Mom had tried to keep my dad away from me, but I always knew he cared and wanted to be part of my life. Before the divorce, Dad and I would go fishing, camping, and spend time outdoors. I developed a love for nature I could never shake and didn't want to. This made it easy to decide to live in the woods. By 18, I was done putting up with Mike's controlling ways. Although he rarely had a job, he expected me to be up by 7 a.m., even though I worked 5 days a week. Since my junior year, I'd saved money to move out. Being away from him and Mom was my goal. I left school, got my GED, and started planning. On days off, I thought I deserved to sleep in, but Mike had other ideas. The stress from work was bad enough, and when Mike barged in, yelling for me to wake up, I told him to back off. He moved like he was going to hit me, so I reacted and knocked him down. That was the last straw. I knew he'd call the cops, so I grabbed my backpack and left, never intending to go back. I wandered around town, no plan or vehicle, as the sun set. Eventually, I found some woods on the outskirts, walked far enough in to be hidden from the road, made a fire, and set up a bed with leaves and clothes. That night was unexpectedly cozy, but I didn't see it as a long-term plan. I thought I'd find an empty place to stay temporarily, but that turned out to be tougher than expected. All the decent places were either secured or used by gangs. Spending the night on the ground wasn't ideal, so midweek, I stopped by a store, got a sleeping bag, and built a makeshift shelter with foil-lined tarp to reflect heat from the fire, making the nights much warmer. To keep clean, I used public bathrooms and laundromats, sometimes staying overnight at the 24-hour ones. My coworkers noticed but didn't say anything. Eventually, I found a nearby river to wash in. Life out there wasn't as bad as it could have been, though it wasn't ideal. My camp was next to railroad tracks, which often had drifters passing through. A makeshift hobo camp was about half a mile away, across the tracks. I discovered it one evening by following the tracks, which were safer than the busier roads. Once, as I headed back to camp, I saw firelight through the trees. I peeked down a hill and saw 3 older guys around a fire. They saw me and invited me to join them. I mostly listened to their stories until they asked my name and where I was going. I made up a name, said I lived nearby, and we talked about a life riding the rails. At some point, they let me try a cheap bottle of wine. Not something I'd recommend, but I came to like it. The colder season rolled in, bringing chilly nights and some unruly drifters. I was almost one of them by then, sharing many evenings with regulars by the fire, listening to stories and passing around bottles. One of the more unpredictable drifters was an older guy named Pete. He stayed quiet at first but got aggressive when he drank too much. One night, he picked a fight with me. He knocked me down and started kicking me until the others pulled him off. After that, I kept my distance from unfamiliar faces. I followed this rule until I got too trusting and ran into trouble. It was this second incident that eventually pushed me to finally get my own place. As fall approached, I was promoted at work. The extra money helped, as I was mostly spending my paychecks just trying to survive. One day, I saw another guy about my age walking toward me with a backpack. He seemed all right and introduced himself as Ben. He said he'd come from Oklahoma City, and we talked for a bit before going our separate ways. Later, we continued our conversation by the fire, sharing stories. The second night, I let slip that it was payday. I was usually cautious about my earnings. I never let people see me with much cash and hid my savings in various spots, which I moved around regularly. That night, Ben asked if he could borrow some money. I told him I'd spent what I had on the bottle we were sharing, but he didn't believe me. He pulled out a long pocket knife and I realized he was serious. Terrified, I held on to the lie as long as I could, but fear overtook me. Just as I was about to turn and run, Ben took a swipe, slashing my arm. I started backing away up the hill, watching him, when another figure stepped out of the shadows behind him. It was another guy from the group, Sam, holding a sturdy stick. He'd overheard Ben calling me Mr. Moneybags earlier and suspected something was up. Ben started stirring, cursing Sam, who warned him to leave or get a worse beating. Ben took off and I didn't see him again. For safety, I spent the next few nights at the hobo camp and took a different route to work for a while. 2 attacks in under a year were enough. I'd saved enough to get a place. That weekend, I searched online and by Sunday evening, I was sleeping in my very own, if tiny, apartment. A few months later, I found a better place and stayed there for 3 years. Sometimes I think back to Sam and the other guys. They were kinder than most people would imagine, but even surrounded by good people, living rough isn't something I'd recommend to anyone. This happened to my wife and me last year, right after the restrictions were lifted in our area. As soon as it was safe, we packed up our gear and decided to hike at our local nature reserve. Hiking was something we used to do a lot before we got married, and I was really looking forward to it. Our plan was to trek out to a particular lake, camp overnight, and then head back the next day. The weather was clear and warm, and the trails were dry. For most of the morning, we were the only ones on the path. Around halfway to the lake, we stopped for lunch at a campsite. We noticed another couple had the same idea. They were sitting at a stone picnic table, and we asked if we could join them. The conversation started naturally, and soon the 4 of us were chatting about the trail and our plans. It turned out that they were newlyweds on their honeymoon. My wife, being a hopeless romantic, loved hearing this, and she shared how we met and some other sentimental details that I can't quite remember. After about 2 hours, we said our goodbyes and continued on our way. We reached the lake just before nightfall, tired and hungry. I built a fire and my wife, Laura, prepared a simple meal while I set up the tent. We sat by the fire, roasted marshmallows, and talked for a while before heading to bed around 10 p.m. The next morning, I woke up before dawn, stoked the fire, and started breakfast. Laura and I repeated our roles from the night before, except this time I took down the tent and packed everything up. I made sure the fire was completely out, and we hit the trail to head back home. At 10 a.m., we made it back to the midpoint but didn't stop. 2 hours further up the trail, we came across the husband from the couple we'd met. Strangely, his wife wasn't with him. Laura asked where she was, and the man said she'd become sick the night before and had to go back home. When he said this, he seemed uneasy and wouldn't meet our eyes. Before we could ask more, he quickly added that his wife had insisted he finish the hike alone. It was a bit odd, but we didn't have a reason to doubt him. Just then, a group of hikers came by, and he excused himself to join them. I didn't feel the need to ask more. It wasn't our business. Laura seemed like she wanted to stay longer, but I reminded her that we had things to take care of at home. She reluctantly agreed, and we continued on our way. We arrived at the parking lot soon after and packed our gear. There were a few groups of people talking, and we saw several cars, including a ranger's truck, pull in. I didn't think anything of it at the time. We got home later that afternoon and took care of some family matters. It wasn't until the next morning at breakfast that we heard the news. I grabbed a cup of coffee and turned on the TV just in time to catch a news report about a woman who had died while camping. When they showed her picture on the screen, I almost spilled my coffee. It was the woman we had met just 2 days earlier. I called Laura into the living room to make sure I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't wearing my glasses, and I pointed at the TV. "Isn't that the newlywed we met at the park?" I asked. Laura stared at the screen and gasped. Right then, a wedding photo of the couple appeared. Laura grabbed the remote and turned up the volume. According to the husband, the couple had been at a popular lookout, a cliffside with a great view. Laura and I had been there a couple of times before. They had watched the sunrise, and when they were about to leave, the wife lost her footing and fell to the ground below. It was believable, but something didn't sit right with me. Why hadn't he told us this when we met? Why the illness story? The way he had acted just didn't make sense. If something like that had happened to me, I would have been a mess. We had passed at least 15 other people on the trail that morning, and no one had spoken to us about the incident. It all seemed strange. I was glad Laura shared my suspicion. She had a gut feeling that something wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the feeling either. We talked for a while about what we should do and decided it might be worth contacting the authorities. I called the sheriff's office and told them what we knew. They put me on hold, and when they returned, they said someone might contact us later, but no one ever did. It's been almost a year, and no one has reached out to us. This is why I'm emailing you now. What do you think? My instincts and Laura's are telling us that something may have gone wrong, but we have no evidence to back it up. If the police thought we had useful information, they'd have called us by now, right? I don't want to cause trouble for a grieving man who appears to be a decent person, but I can't ignore this feeling. Should we keep pushing for answers or just leave it to the police to handle? I just have this nagging suspicion that something much worse happened, and the man is getting away with it. Although this story is far from finished, most of what I'm going to tell you happened around 12 years ago. It was about 2012, and I was still living with my parents. We had moved into the neighborhood when I was 14. Not long after, I found the woods across the street. I ended up making the woods my escape because of the bullying I went through and the stress at home. This neighborhood didn't have many kids, and the few that lived here were much older than me. All the tension made me a nervous wreck. Any free time I had, I spent by myself. One day, I decided to explore the woods. There didn't seem to be anyone else out there, and that gave me a sense of peace, something I hadn't felt in a while. I came across a small cluster of cedar trees that created a secluded clearing, and I started calling it my hideaway. As time passed, I spent more and more time there. I even ended up falling asleep in the trees one night. I thought for sure my parents would flip, but they never even noticed. From that point on, I started camping in my little spot on weekends. First, no one seemed to miss me. I quickly realized I needed proper camping gear, so I began going door to door, offering to mow lawns. I had never mowed a lawn before, but that didn't matter. The biggest challenge was finding a lawnmower. I'd sneak my dad's mower out, do the job, and eventually got caught and punished. Thankfully, I saved up enough to buy a cheap lawnmower of my own. With my new lawnmower in tow, I started working for real money. Once I had enough saved up, I rode my barely functioning bike about 5 miles to an army surplus store. I bought an Alice pack full of camping gear I thought would be useful. I was so excited that I skipped a week of school to test out my new equipment and camped out in my spot. It became an obsession, but more than that, it was the only place where I felt safe and happy for years to come. I went to school just enough to stay under the radar, but most afternoons I would head straight to my hideaway. By then, I considered the woods my territory. Anyone else out there felt like an intruder. So when I encountered 2 men one Sunday afternoon, I didn't hesitate to defend my space. I'd been camping all weekend and was walking to the creek to gather water. About 50 yards away, I noticed a camper parked on a deserted road. 2 men were moving in and out of it, but they didn't notice me. When I returned a few hours later, they were still there, now drinking beer and shooting guns. I was angry, but it wasn't until a stray bullet landed just inches from me that I couldn't take it anymore. I ran home, called the sheriff, and made up a story about being lost and threatened by the men with their guns. I didn't think anyone would trace the call back to me, but the following day I heard a news report about a drug bust, and my call was mentioned. The sheriff had tracked down the men after receiving an anonymous tip. They were arrested for manufacturing drugs in the camper. I realized the seriousness of the situation and was terrified, but I believed no one would figure out that I was the one who made the call. A few months later, I got an anonymous letter in the mail. It just said, "You messed with the wrong people, kid." The fear hit me like a ton of bricks, but I still didn't think it was from the men. A week later, I got another letter, more threatening. "You better pray we get time served." I couldn't understand how they knew it was me, but by that point, I was just scared and didn't want to think about it. The letters kept coming. Then, during their trial, the judge sentenced both men to 20 years after finding them guilty of drug manufacturing and possession of firearms. I thought for sure my time was running out. I stopped going to school and spent all my time hiding in the woods. I knew it wouldn't protect me, but if I was going to die, I wanted it to happen in a place I loved. Strangely, the death I feared never came. Month after month, I began to feel like it had all been a bluff, or perhaps just a way to intimidate me. Life went on, and the last 10 years were filled with ups and downs, with the 2 men from the woods becoming a distant memory. Then, last week, I got another anonymous letter. It read, "You better write a will. The end is near." I dropped it in shock, and my girlfriend saw it. She read it too and seemed worried, but I brushed it off as a prank. I didn't explain anything to her. Now, the fear from my past has returned. I feel like I'm always looking over my shoulder. I'm terrified that these men might go after my girlfriend or our baby. I briefly considered going to the police, but without proof of who sent the letters, I know they can't do much. My options feel limited. With no one else to talk to, I'm anonymously sharing this story, hoping someone will hear it. Please be careful with the choices you make when you're young. Wish me luck and keep my family in your prayers. In the summer of 2006, I was hiking the paths of a nearby national forest, as I'd been doing for several years. The hour-long drive to the forest went smoothly, as usual. I parked by the ranger's office and let him know my plans. After a final check of my backpack, I set off on my 2-mile trek to my usual campsite. I had no idea that someone's life had just taken a tragic turn, and that I'd soon be pulled into it. My love for the outdoors began after the events of September 11th. Though I wasn't directly near any of the attack sites, I lost someone very close to me. She and I had been college sweethearts but drifted apart. Thanks to the internet, we reconnected, and we were planning to meet for Thanksgiving to explore renewing our relationship. The news of her passing shattered me, and I started planning my own end. I got as far as packing a bag and heading to a remote spot, but something shifted when I arrived. The beauty of the landscape took hold of me, balancing the pain I felt with a calming peace. That moment changed my mind. My grief stayed with me for some time, but whenever it felt overwhelming, I'd return to nature, finding a way to cope. So here we were in the summer of 2006. My retreats had become a regular habit. Nothing unusual happened that first evening. The next day, I thought over my plans and decided to hike down into the canyons. I often found some small arrowheads or stones for my growing collection. After a quick oatmeal breakfast, I set out down the trail. About halfway down a cliffside, I noticed a glint of light, though I couldn't find the source right away. Another flash temporarily blinded me. When my vision cleared, I saw 2 arms waving around about 40 feet down the cliff. I hurried down the trail for a better view. There was a small rock ledge on the side, so I jumped onto it, but it began to crumble beneath me. The fall felt endless, and I braced myself for a painful landing, but thankfully, it wasn't as bad as I'd feared. Lying on my back, I looked up and saw I'd only fallen about 15 feet. I stayed there a moment, then remembered why I'd come down. Trying to stand, I noticed my left foot was stuck between 2 large rocks. I pushed the top one and wiggled my leg free. Once on my feet, I looked around and saw a woman lying nearly motionless off to my right. Carefully, I made my way down the slope until I reached her. She looked lifeless at first, but then I saw her lips moving. Kneeling beside her, I began speaking in a calm voice. I asked her name. Her eyes opened slowly, and a faint smile crossed her face. "I thought I'd lost you when I saw that rock give way," she said in a hoarse but gentle voice. "Sorry to bother you, sir, but do you have any water?" I quickly rummaged through my bag and pulled out my bottle. It was a bit dented but still intact. I slowly held the opening to her lips, letting her drink a small amount. I knew too much too quickly could make her sick. Over the next few minutes, she explained how she'd ended up there. Occasionally, I gave her a little more water. She was clearly in severe pain, and I knew I couldn't delay if she was to get help. I told her my plan, covered her with the fleece from my pack, and started the climb back up the rocky hillside. Climbing up was much harder, and by then, I was in considerable pain, especially in my back. I tried to jog but had to settle for a brisk walk. The journey was long and difficult, but I made it to the ranger's post a little after 1 p.m. The ranger quickly assembled a rescue team, and I had to settle for an ambulance ride and an overnight hospital stay. It was close to 6:30 p.m. when I saw the emergency staff bringing her in. Sadly, she had to be rushed into surgery soon after, so there was a long wait for any news. But when it finally came, it was positive. Despite having a punctured lung, a concussion, a broken arm, and other injuries, she would fully recover. My own journey toward healing is a story for another time, but her name was Karen, was reunited with her family and went on to start her own. Last I heard, she was living in Utah with her husband and 3 kids. I hope everyone joins me in wishing her a long and joyful life. I'm just grateful I was there when she needed someone most. When I was younger, I always dreamed of becoming a scout. Back then, it was still a well-regarded group that taught practical outdoor skills. I think I was around 9 when I finally convinced my mom to let me join. She was hesitant at first. Back in her home country, groups like Scouts were often just a cover for military-style training for kids. I asked our den leader to talk to her, and after a long list of questions, she finally relaxed. With that hurdle cleared, I became a Cub Scout. Sadly, scouting in my area wasn't quite what I'd hoped for. Our leader was a high-strung single mom who lacked enthusiasm, which was a big disappointment to me. About 6 months in, though, there was a glimmer of excitement. A scout leader from another town invited us to join his group for a weekend camping trip. This was one of the main reasons I'd wanted to join Scouts in the first place. I loved going camping with my family, but those trips had ended after my parents split up. The leader picked us up early on a Saturday morning and drove us all to the campsite. There were only about 8 or 9 kids there in total. He gathered us around and gave instructions on how to set up the tents. Each tent would sleep 2 boys, but because of the odd number, I got a tent to myself. One by one, he showed us our spots and we started setting up. A few needed help, but everything went pretty smoothly overall. The rest of the morning was filled with first aid lessons and general safety. I was paired with the leader and ended up being the demo subject, wrapped in bandages and carried on a makeshift stretcher. It was fun and, as it turned out, would come in handy later. After first aid training, we had lunch and took a short rest until about 3 p.m., when we were all called back for archery lessons. I was beyond excited. Ever since seeing my first action movie, I dreamed of shooting a bow. This was my first real chance. The leader gave us a brief tutorial stressing safety. But, of course, we were a bunch of energetic preteen boys, so not everyone was paying full attention. I was the first to try. I pulled back the string, crouching down like a ninja, which got me scolded. I had to stand upright, which was a bit of a letdown, but it was thrilling to see the arrow land where I'd aimed. After my turn, everyone else got their shot, and then we were allowed to practice on our own. The boys all chatted, challenging each other to see who could shoot better. Then, the unexpected happened. A boy named Kevin was talking to another boy, Chris, while holding an arrow with the string pulled back about a quarter of the way. Chris said something that made Kevin turn toward him. Kevin must have slipped or accidentally let go because the arrow flew forward, hitting Chris in the chest and going in about 8 inches. Everything turned to chaos. The leader started yelling for the first aid supplies, while Chris struggled to breathe. There wasn't much he could do except pack the wound and keep Chris calm. 2 boys were sent running to the ranger station about a half-mile away, and the rest of us stood there in shock. Kevin was the only one moving around, repeating, "I'm sorry," until the leader told him to be quiet. The ambulance arrived about 20 minutes later, though it felt like an eternity. That was the end of the trip. We quickly packed up, and the leader drove us home. On the ride back, Kevin seemed to fully realize the gravity of what had happened, and his cries are something I'll never forget. In my opinion, it was just a tragic accident, though some others saw it differently. One kid later claimed Chris had called Kevin a name no one our age wanted to be called, and Kevin had shot him because of it. Only Kevin knows the truth, and he's never spoken about it. I didn't hear about Chris's condition until the next morning. He'd been rushed into surgery, which went well. The arrow had punctured his left lung, missing his heart by just an inch. He made a full recovery, much to Kevin's relief. It was ruled an accident, and no charges were filed. A few months later, Kevin met with Chris to formally apologize, and from what I've heard, Chris accepted without holding a grudge. As for me, my days in Scouts ended the moment my mom found out about the incident. I didn't mind too much, though, since I ended up getting into BMX, which turned out to be a lot safer overall.